weeks ago, because I knew this sermon was coming, and I listened to a podcast that explored why the modern day church had become less focused on the second coming in the 21st century. And as I was listening to it, I thought, I bet this is pre-pandemic, because during the pandemic, I guess we're still kind of coming out of it, but man, I heard a lot about the second coming during the pandemic. I heard a lot about the mark of the beast. I heard a lot about, it's a pandemic. We know that pestilences make up part of the signs, the end time signs. I heard a lot about it. And when I checked the date of the podcast, sure enough, it was like something like January 2020. I was like, So why? Why did we all start talking about the end times? Well, from what I just said as well, that we know that pestilences make up some of those end time event signs. So anyway, look, I have heard many theories about the end times and the current state of the world over the last 3 years. I, like Lani, I'm not going to speculate. Like, I mean, you can't help it. You do wonder. You hear things and you think, oh, that's interesting, and you kind of go back to those Revelation and Daniel seminars. And and I'm actually, in your discussion questions, I've actually got one of the questions I actually have in there is about those prophecy seminars. So it'll be interesting to see what you guys talk about when you get into your small groups. All right, but anyway, today we're talking about promises. And this week, I've really been, because I've been praying for this sermon, I've really been engaging with the promise of the second coming. And I've been thinking about the fact that it really is a promise. I think that often we, in our enthusiasm to try to convey the fact that, that Jesus is coming, we can, instead of really emphasizing that the second coming is a promise, we emphasize it as a threat. And so today I am really going to focus on the promise of the coming. And I'm going to explore three main areas. I'm going to explore the promise of judgment, because it sounds really bizarre, but I've been sort of thinking about it a bit differently this week. The promise of salvation and renewal, and finally the promise of hope. All right, and then I'll reflect on how the promise of the second coming can actually influence our day-to-day lives. All right, so I'm just going to talk about judgment first. And the reason why I picked judgment is because I do think that over the last couple of decades, the concept of God's judgment has got a bad rap. Humans are very happy to judge each other. We love to judge each other, but God judging us, we got to, that's, I don't know about that, which I find really funny. And also we're really cognizant of the fact that a law system is necessary, that judgment is necessary in our day-to-day society, because we need to keep order in society. If a person breaks the law, then there's expectation that they'll pay a price. The threat of judgment causes us to pause before we drink and drive, and consequently put the lives of others in danger. It helps us to pause before violently responding in a fit of rage. It's there, and so it does help us to pause. And I was having a discussion with a friend a couple of weeks ago who is an atheist, and he was commenting on the fact that a lot of religious traditions, most religious traditions in fact, have a teaching about judgment. And I thought, actually, that's really interesting. So I Googled it. And that most religions do have something about judgment. Buddhism teaches reincarnation. Islam teaches that after death, an individual is questioned about their faith by two angels, before it's decided where they'll end up. Even the ancient Egyptians believed that when they died, their heart would be placed on a balance held by a god in order to determine if a soul could pass on to the afterlife. So perhaps the idea of judgment permeates so many religious traditions because as human beings, while we may fear judgment, we also know instinctively that there is wisdom in judgment. After all, we live in a sinful, fallen world. and judgment is needed to keep and restore order. It's sad, but it's just true. I'm reading a book by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks called The Great Partnership. I do recommend it. It's taking me a long time to read, but when I do finish it, I'll put it back in the church library, and you are welcome to go and borrow it. But he talks about the horrors of the Holocaust, and because he's a Jew, so obviously it touched him in personal ways, and he argues that the Holocaust exposed the ultimate failings of mankind, and I'll read this quote, which to me, I might read it to you and you go, oh, that's nice, but this blew my mind this week. More than half of the participants at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 who planned the final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of all Europe's Jews, carried the title doctor. They either had doctorates or were medical practitioners. This was devastating to me. I have known people who lost their faith in God during the Holocaust and others who kept it. But that anyone can have faith in humanity after Auschwitz, to me, defies belief. Humanity has a lot to answer for. Nazism and the atrocities associated with it are often exemplified as the ultimate depiction of evil. Like in Hollywood, they always use that. You just know that they've been influenced by, they're not influenced by Nazism, but they're using Nazism to portray evil or some political group as evil. It's really influenced our culture. And so Nazism Nazism and the atrocities associated with it are often exemplified as the ultimate depiction of evil, but we know that humans have shown their capacity for evil repeatedly through Earth's history. And I was just thinking of a few this week. I was thinking of the Cambodian and Rwandan genocides. Hiroshima, which I know, you can debate the ethics of, but it was still horrendous. The crimes against Indigenous people across the globe. I think of the atrocities that accompanied the idealistic ideologies of the Russian and French Revolution, the crimes of war in Ukraine, the young men and civilians that died in two world wars that were triggered and then fueled by the evil ambitions of powerful men. It's just constant. And when you think about all of the atrocities that humanity is responsible for, I think to myself, yeah, I get why there's judgment. I get why there's a day of reckoning. I totally understand, and there must be a day of reckoning, a day of judgment. Otherwise, how do we as a human race get past the atrocities that have darkened so much of the world's history? How can we possibly move forward? Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay." That's a promise. That is a promise. God is the only. This week there was a really interesting case of a father who was jailed through the Court of Appeal, or after the Court of Appeal ruled that he should be jailed, because I don't know if you guys heard the story, but he took his 2-year-old for a ride on his buggy. Yeah, and on a motorbike, and then it overturned, and then the 2-year-old died. And initially, the first judge, that would be the Supreme Court, said that he felt that, in his ruling, he felt that the father had suffered enough, and he would have to live with the guilt for the rest of his life. And so he chose to give him, I think it was 250 hours of community service and 3 years of probation. The prosecutor pursued the case. He wasn't happy with the sentence, and so it went to the Court of Appeal, and the judges there decided that he should be jailed for a minimum of 6 months. That was the non-parole period, and up to 1.5 years. And it was just interesting to see the differences in the rulings. And I thought human judges, I I personally would have gone with the first judge, but I understand that there's different precedents and laws. And I thought, human law, we do our best. We do our best with judgment, but only God really understands he sees the bigger picture. He sees the finer details. He's the only one that can really pass the ultimate judgment. The judgment that we can be confident in. It's a promise. It's a promise that when he says that he will judge the world, it's not. I recognise that the teaching of judgment has been abused. I think that's the problem. It's been used to fill church coffers. It's been used to control and coerce through history. But it's not the teaching of judgment that is controlling or coercive. The teaching is, in fact, a promise rather than a threat. A promise God will restore balance and peace in the world, that sin will be reckoned with and, in fact, ultimately just destroyed. The second aspect of this promise of the second coming that I'm going to talk about today briefly is salvation and renewal. And to me, this is the most powerful promise that is drawn out of the doctrine of the second coming. This promise of salvation and renewal. Yes, there will be judgment. That is part of this story, but there is forgiveness, restoration, a new beginning. In Romans 8, Paul paints a picture of creation groaning. Why is it groaning? It's, this was when, I don't know how it is with you, but sometimes, like, I've read Romans through so many times, and I read chapter 8 this week, and I was like, wow, I've never really stopped and paused and thought this through. So Romans 8, I really encourage you to go home and read the full chapter. It's quite, it's really beautiful. Paul says creation is groaning. Why? Because sin left it empty, incomplete, frustrated. That's the word that Paul uses in 8:20, that in Romans 8:20, that creation has been left frustrated. It was meant to be so different at the beginning of time. The world was meant to be so different, and sin has come and completely changed the lay of the land. And so creation grieves along with God, with the heavens, with us, at the carnage that sin has wrought. And so in the same chapter, in verse 19, we read about what will relieve this frustration, and it's that creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. That is what will relieve the frustration when we are unmasked as the heirs to, as God's heirs, basically, the sons of God. Timothy Keller writes that nature is alienated. It's alienated both from us, because we were meant to live together in harmony as its directors, its rulers, but also alienated from itself. It is not as beautiful or great as it was meant to be. And so at the end, the coming of Christ will bring renewal and rescue nature from decay, when, just like at the same time that we are rescued and revealed. And in what way are we, the sons and daughters of God, revealed? In 1 Corinthians 15:52, Paul promises that we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, we know this, right? The trumpet will sound, and the dead will raise imperishable, and we will be changed. We will be revealed as the sons and daughters of God, who are recreated by God at the second advent. Something to note is that the Bible really does emphasize that the change and renewal is a physical thing. Our bodies will be physically transformed, and we will become immortal beings. So at the resurrection, body and soul are physically united. In verse 54, Paul writes that at this point of the resurrection story, death is ultimately swallowed up in victory. He writes in verse 56 that God gives us victory over sin and death through our Lord Jesus Christ. And so we have this physical evidence of this victory, immortality and rescue from decay. Consider also the detail with which John describes the New Jerusalem. And if you really are not into the questions that I've written for you, for your groups, just go to the last 2 chapters of Revelation. Just read through those and just discuss them. And think about the detail that is used to describe the New Jerusalem. John lays out the measurements, the number of gates. I used to think, why? Why is he doing this? Like it's so specific. He's really detailed and specific about the types of costly stones that make up the foundations and walls of the city. And the point to Timothy Keller, actually, this idea comes from Timothy Keller. It was a sermon I was listening to, and I thought, wow, that is so true. The point that John could be making is that the city it's tangible, it's physical. It's real. It's a real physical city. Later in Revelation, there's also the description of the tree of life running through the city, reminding us again of this physicality of this is real. Renewal, salvation, symbolizing renewal, salvation. Because of the forgiveness of sin through the blood of Jesus, the saints can eat freely from the tree of life. They can dwell in God's city. The earth is completely made new. Creation and the sons of God have been reconciled. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. Creation and humanity restored, creation and humanity reconciled, creation and God reconciled. And the final aspect of this promise that I'm going to talk about is hope. Now, I'm really apologetic because I do like a bit of history, and so I probably put a bit too much in this section, but it's interesting, all right? So that's what I used to always say to the kids when I used to teach, go with it, guys, come on. All right, so go with it. All right, so I'm going to just talk about what I'm always fascinated with is the early church. I find the early church really, really interesting because I think to myself, how committed and passionate must those early Christians have been to be so willing to live with the challenges that came with being an early Christian in the Roman Empire, in this pagan world. And that's often used, of course, as one of the arguments for the existence of God. Why would someone put their life on the line? Sorry, and be willing to be literally thrown to the lions for something that just wasn't real. So I spent a little bit of time reading. It wasn't really, it was only a few pages, but I do recommend historian Bruce Shelley's book if you're interested in Christian history. It's called Church History in Plain Language, and you can just get it down at Koorong so he explores the hardships facing the early Christians in that book, Church History in Plain Language. He explains that the early Christian church's hard line against paganism and insistence on preaching their faith so freely and fervently frustrated the Roman authorities and citizens. The Christians refused to worship the emperor as a living God. And then their gospel message encouraged others to refuse to worship the emperor as well. So they were really annoying to an empire that was really trying to promote the idea that the emperor was was God, basically. But it was more than that was frustrating to the Roman authorities and society. They also refused to participate. I guess it would depend on degrees, and I really want to just let you know that it's, sometimes when we think of the early Christians, we just assume they were all martyred and they all lived these really hard lie. That's not true. So when I say that Christians refuse to participate in anything associated with paganism, well, I don't actually know every single Christian, chose that. But we do have primary documents that do support a lot of what Bruce Shelley is saying. But yeah, it's important to know that I'm just being a teacher. Just ignore me. Don't worry. Just trying to make sure you understand. All right. Anyway, so they refused to participate in anything associated with paganism, and so that people really didn't trust them. They viewed them as antisocial. They didn't worship the deities that regulated the seasons. I mean, what do you know? We need the gods to bless our crops. How can you not worship? How can you not worship them? They refused to begin their meals with an offering and prayer to the pagan gods. And according to Shelley, most Roman feasts were connected to temples and sacrifices made to the Roman and Greek deities, and often the feasts were actually held within temple precincts. So that's kind of where a lot of socializing happened. So if you didn't want to hang out in a temple precinct, you probably weren't going to socialize much. So you were becoming a social outcast. They would decline to, that's it. Because they declined to attend these pagan festivities, because they declined to hang out in these temple precincts, they were labelled as rude. You're rude. You don't want to hang out with us. And they were accused of also offending the gods. Christians didn't attend the fashionable amphitheatres to roar with other spectators at the gladiators, because they disagreed with this idea of slaves and prisoners being forced to fight each other to the death. Instead, Christians were known to hang out with slaves, which was like, just why? Really, they were just really fringe and bizarre. So I'm just going to go a little bit more and then I'll stop. We also know that Christians would also, I've never even thought about this, but economically, they may have struggled to find work if they didn't want to engage in aspects of the economy that were linked to pagan worship. Because think about it, a lot of the structures in the city were pagan temples. They may not have, if you were a mason, you may not have wanted to contribute to the building of this pagan temple. If you were a tailor, you may not have wanted to make robes for the many pagan priests. So it really could have been quite challenging. There's even a story, I think this is around 200 AD, stories of Christian school teachers who were refusing to teach because they had to teach young Roman men or to observe religious festivals, and they were like, well, I'm just not comfortable in doing that. So it was hard. Being a Christian in the first few hundred years after Christ's death, it was challenging. And then, of course, there was the threat of death. As Christians established themselves as a fringe group in society, suspicion about them increased. When a fire broke out in Rome in the year 64, a rumour circulated that the emperor of the day, Nero, was behind the fire. It was probably just a random fire, but people blamed him. But because the Christians were already a fringe group, because there was already so much suspicion about them, Nero was and his authorities, they just passed on the suspicion to the Christians. And so mass arrests of Christians followed. Many were martyred in the most horrific ways, which I'm not going to go into today. And some scholars actually believe that Peter and Paul were martyred around that time. So when we really consider the challenges that went alongside being a Christian in the 1st and 2nd century, Paul's encouragement to the Romans to exult in their tribulations and to hope for what they could not see seems really understandable. It's a choice. Being a Christian is a choice today, and being a Christian was a choice then. You don't have to stick with it. And Paul was saying it's worth it. it's worth it. And so when I was reading through some of his promises, and I thought, wow, he really is so passionate about he's passionate about everything, but really passionate about when he's talking about the second coming. Paul was encouraging the Romans to stand firm in their commitment to Christ when their livelihoods, social credit, and even lives could be at stake in the knowledge that Jesus would return a second time and take them home. Like John, he also, I really picked this up this week, he wanted to emphasize the physicality of the second coming. In 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17, he paints a vivid picture of the coming of the Lord. He writes that the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. The dead in Christ will rise first, and after that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Really specific. Following this description, Paul writes in verse 18, therefore, and this is what today's about. This is what the last few weeks have been about, right? Therefore, encourage one another with these words. It makes sense. It's about encouragement. That's one of the reasons why we're here. We're here to cry with each other. I had a bit of a cry at the beginning. I feel comfortable to do that. But we're also here to encourage each other, right? Therefore, encourage one another with these words. It makes sense why the early Christians, with all their challenges, would seek to encourage each other with the hope of the second coming. But we can do that too. Yeah, we're not living in this, we're not living in Rome. We don't have to be afraid of being sewn up in animal skins. And I told you I wouldn't say what used to happen to them, but yeah, it was. You go away and look it up if you're interested. But yeah, we can forget too quickly the ancient promise that Jesus is coming soon. It is an ancient promise, and that's part of the problem, right? It feels ancient, but it's not. Well, I mean, it is ancient, like it's been around for a long time, but it is. For us today, it is still so relevant for us today. So I'm really wanting to say today, hey, let's encourage each other with the hope of salvation and renewal, because this promise is for us. We also live through challenging times. I don't know how people feel if you're having a challenging time and someone turns to you and says, hey, God's coming soon. I don't know. I know that sometimes that can be like a bit, but we can, I guess if we talk about the coming more often and just keep it in the forefront of our minds and not always in the back. Because in our comfortable modern Western world, we can forget to hope. It's really easy, especially in our comfortable Western lives, when we have not experienced the type of challenges that the early church faced. When we are young, the second coming, the day of judgment and renewal, seems so distant. I remember hearing a joke somewhere, you're an Adventist if you hope that Jesus is coming like a little bit after you get married, or, I get that. Like, I understand that. But instead of hoping for a new life in a new world, we're busy living the one that we already have. And I do get that. But later in life, it's more about busy. We get busy. We have a family, a career, a home. We've accumulated some wealth. Our lives become about maintaining what we have. They become about maintaining what we have acquired, or adding to what we already have. And so, with less time at our disposal, we tend to put. There's just not so much time, and so it's hard to keep friendships and to keep those social contacts up and keep our homes maintained and our reputations secure, and that's where our energy goes. But how tragic. I was thinking this week, I thought it's so tragic. And also, like, I should tell you what is tragic. How tragic to forget a promise that we can have such a profound impact on the way that we see life and the way that we live our lives. It's so sad. I'm actually going to start asking the band to come up. The promise of Christ's return reminds us that it is the laying up of treasures in heaven that matters, rather than hoarding the treasures on earth. It helps us to remember what is truly important in our day-to-day. for those of us who are a little more seasoned, we may be less inclined toward taking risks. I'm beginning to understand that taking risks is kind of a given for being a Christian, something that I'm starting to reconcile with. It's a risk to tell others that we are Christians. It can feel like that more and more. It's a risk to give up employment because of a religious conviction. It's a risk to donate more than you did last week because, you might not have as much money in your account. It's a risk to stop and chat to someone that you feel is hard work to communicate with. It's a risk to stop hoarding treasures on earth because we want to feel secure. It's natural. And we also have FOMO. We are worried that we might miss out on something. The truth is we might miss out on something, but it won't be anything, Solomon figured out long before Jesus walked on the earth that, he said, except for God, everything else is vanity. And Paul's message to the early church was that the earth doesn't really have anything that we will miss, except for each other, right? That's why he urges us. He urged the early church, the medieval church, all the churches in between. He's urged believers to hope and persevere towards something bigger and lasting. Now, if you are young and I have bored you to tears, listen now. Okay, so if you're under apparently 35, it's young. All right, if you are young and you love Jesus, but would like Jesus to delay the second coming a little bit because you're very excited about maybe having a career or, we all felt like this, right? Some of us did. I know I was excited about life. I was excited. Excited about having a family or being married or whatever. Okay, if you feel like that, don't feel bad, but thank God for your amazingly privileged life. Because if you're living in Turkey this week, I have a funny feeling that you would be really if you're a Christian, particularly living in Turkey this week, I think you'd be really wanting Jesus to come. It's just horrendous. And today's offering, did go to I'm just going to say this, but apparently, so these poor people that have been rescued from the rubble, and the rescue's going to go on for months, of course. Well, no, the rescue will go on for a couple more days probably, and then it's something else, it's recovery. But apparently now these people have been rescued and they haven't, depending on where they are, they have no clean water or they have no sanitation Anyway, if you are young and you're loving life, thank God that you are. It's a blessing, right? But live like a believing Christian. Think about how you can support those who don't lead your privileged life. Cultivate a relationship with the Lord so that you can cultivate hope. And so the idea of Jesus coming just becomes sweeter and sweeter and sweeter every day. In 1 Thessalonians 5:2, Paul reminds us that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. But then in verse 4, he stresses that as children of the Lord, it's another thing that I missed. This is where you can read the Bible 100 times, a million times, and you still, sorry. Okay. In verse 4, he stresses that as children of the Lord, we are not living in the darkness. And so the second coming should not surprise us like a thief. I haven't thought of that before. So basically what Paul is saying is, yes, we know he's coming like a thief, but not really for those of us that know he's coming. When he comes, we're not going to be like, oh, I really didn't expect you. He would say, really? He's not hiding behind a planet ready to jump out and surprise the world and make us all upset. That's actually not what his intention are. He has promised this. It's a promise. His return is a promise that is deeply profound. It's not just about trumpets and clouds of angels and fire. It is ultimately about justice, redemption, and restoration. It can be our blessed hope. It can be a promise that we live by if we let it be. Wouldn't it be amazing if we lived out the promise of Christ's return daily, and if we encouraged each other with the promise of it? I suspect that we would worry less and give more. We would get less angry over silly details that only matter in the moment, and instead smile at strangers more often. Jesus is coming back. The event may be in the future, but the promise is for today.